Hello and welcome to DM It All, the show where we discuss D&D books and tabletop gaming history. In the past we've done videos on the monk and rogue classes, detailing their evolution throughout D&D's lifespan. We highlighted how these iconic classes had an unfortunate history of not being very good, at least until recently. In today's episode, we're going to discuss a class that has always been a reliable choice. Except instead of being a jack of all trades and master of none, this class excels at one thing and pretty much nothing else. Today, we're going to analyze the Big Dumb Fighter. The Fighter traces its roots back to D&D's conception, where it was originally known under the moniker of the Fighting Man class. The Fighting Man, the Cleric, and the Magic User made up the three core classes in the original White Box from 1975. The Fighting Man was the most fundamental of the classes, as it was not only available to all of the races, but also represented more of an everyman. Spellcasters were rare in the old school setting, while foolhardy fighters were practically a dime a dozen. While Magic User and Cleric players had complex spells to memorize in addition to the core rules, fighters only had to worry about rolling a d20 to hit their enemy. D&D was based on a 1971 war game called Chainmail, where armies were mostly made up of disposable footmen. The rare hero and superhero units represented iconic warriors from fiction, such as Aragorn and Conan. D&D's levels were based on the hero rankings from Chainmail, so high-level fighters were meant to imitate these powerful figures of legend. However, this meant that the low-level fighters found their equivalent in the nameless, minimally trained foot soldier from a gritty wargame. Magic users in Chainmail were also rare hero units, equipped with powerful spells that could swing the tide of battle. D&D Magic users, in turn, could completely alter the direction of a campaign with any number of their high-level spells, but given their uncommon nature, they required protection, typically in the form of a retinue of fighters. A level 1 Magic user only had one spell per day, and were so fragile that they often started with 4 hit points or less. Armor bonuses were so rare for them that it was better to simply not expect them. Clerics were not present in the original Chainmail game, but in D&D they essentially acted as a middle ground between fighters and magic users. They had weaker spells than the magic user, and couldn't fight as well as the fighter, but were at least trained in both disciplines, although the cleric had some restrictions in the form of edged weapons, meaning they couldn't use arrows or swords. This might seem like a minor inconvenience, but magic swords were basically a class feature in and of themselves. Magic swords were stronger and more common than any other magic weapon, and the fighter basically had exclusive rights to them. The fighter's problems actually started fairly early, thanks to the Greyhawk supplement released later that year in 1975. This booklet added the Thief, a class laser-focused on skills like lockpicking, sneaking, climbing, and trap disarming. The conundrum this brought is that by defining the Thief's area of expertise, it demarcated what the fighter could and couldn't do. Older D&D editions lacked a universal skill system, so if players wanted to attempt an action out of combat, it was up to the DM to adjudicate the odds of that task being successful. The Thief became a major exception to this rule, so DMs had to be wary about making the Thief feel useless. Given that the Thief's abilities were useful in any adventuring group, the other members of the party were made worse as a result. And the Thief had atrociously low odds of success, which all but rendered the other classes useless at those crucial skills. So the Greyhawk supplement reinforced the idea that the fighter was terrible at non-combat abilities, outside of breaking down doors and lifting heavy objects. This is why fighting mans were often referred to as the Big Dumb Fighter, a muscular meatbag only good for smashing things. Never mind the fact that spellcasters were useful both in and out of combat. They also had access to a much wider variety of versatile abilities, such as teleportation, flight, telepathy, and invisibility, just to name a few. This was an intentional decision meant to reward magic users for surviving the early levels. It led to the idea of linear fighters and quadratic wizards, that is, fighters starting off stronger, but magic users growing in power at a much faster pace. This asymmetrical balance wasn't a big sticking point for early D&D, but it worsened as later editions made low-level spellcasters considerably stronger. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons came out in 1978, giving the fighter access to followers as a class feature. Followers would appear when the fighter established their own castle at higher levels. The assumption was that the fighter would transition from menial dungeon exploration to kingdom management at higher levels. The modern era removed this class feature as D&D in general moved away from its wargaming roots. While a logical change, the fighters' greatest impact on the world in AD&D was through their followers. Wizards could dramatically alter the campaign with an endgame spell, but fighters could send out their massive armies to liberate, conquer, or raise territory. A much more enduring class feature for the fighter that AD&D introduced was extra attacks. And by extra attacks, we only mean one, as by max level, the fighter could only make 2 attacks per round. That was until Unearthed Arcana came out in 1985, which introduced the concept of weapon specialization to the official D&D rule set, and made it largely exclusive to the fighter. Fighters can now sacrifice some of their weapon versatility in order to improve the damage and number of attacks made with their favorite weapon type. This eventually led to the infamous 2nd edition Dart Fighter from 1989. Weapons in AD&D could grant multiple attacks in a single round based on their weapon speed, with darts granting 3 attacks per round. Weapon specialization allowed high-level fighters to increase the number of dart attacks up to 6. As if this wasn't strong enough, 2nd edition also allowed characters to add their strength bonus when calculating damage on most ranged weapons. So for a brief period, you could find the most dangerous assassins in the world practicing openly at the town pub. Before we move on, we need to cover the fighter from Basic. Dungeons & Dragons Basic was originally pitched as the simpler alternative to Advanced D&D, but it quickly evolved into its own complex rule set with a wealth of unique supplements. This is evidenced by the optional weapon mastery system introduced in the Master Rules from 1985. This system is similar to weapon specialization, but was ironically more involved than its advanced counterpart. Instead of granting extra attacks, weapon mastery bestowed unique bonuses based on weapon type. Longswords, for example, could now disarm opponents, while two-handed greatswords could be used to stun enemies. At higher levels, characters displaying their weapon mastery could even demoralize opponents, making them flee in terror. Given the granularity of its rules, this system didn't have much of a major influence on later editions. It was also difficult to reach higher mastery abilities because characters needed to seek out an appropriate trainer in their game world. But those that earned tutelage were able to break the combat math due to their unreal attack and defense bonuses alone. Weapon mastery was an interesting idea in the end that made the basic fighter one of the strongest variations of the D&D class back in the day. Lastly, D&D Basic later introduced an optional skill system, developed through various Gazetteer supplements released during the system's lifespan. Skills were based on ability checks, an optional rule that can be traced back to the second release of D&D Basic from 1981. This updated box set included a section titled There's Always a Chance to help dungeon masters make up custom rolls on the fly. These custom rolls were later incorporated into Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, becoming known as ability checks. Ability checks back then had characters rolling against their ability score as a threshold, with success coming at or under the score and failure being over it. So if a character had a high ability score, it was easier to complete a skill as they likely wouldn't roll over a 16, 17, or 18. Fighters typically kept wisdom and intelligence as their lowest scores, as they weren't useful for much outside of spellcasting. Charisma was commonly neglected as well, since it was mostly used for commanding henchmen. These dump stats, as they're known, helped propagate the big dumb fighter stereotype, and for good reason. Fighters were never really punished for dumping these ability scores. The introduction of a universal skills system, however, changed this, as it expanded the general purpose of ability scores. The good news for old school players is that these skill systems were entirely optional, allowing traditional groups to simply roleplay social encounters instead. Overall, the fighter in old school D&D had its issues, but was an essential bulwark of the party. High-level magic users were undoubtedly stronger, but without the fighter's help to survive the early levels, they may as well have been an egg in a blender. This all changed though, once D&D entered the modern era. We call 3rd edition the beginning of the modern era, as it streamlined the older systems, cementing what would become the defining traits of Dungeons & Dragons. It was referred to as the D20 system because everything was altered to function like a D20 attack roll. This includes the new skill system now embedded in the core rules, further restricting the fighter's capabilities. Fighters didn't receive that many class skills, and any skills outside one's class leveled at half their normal rate, no matter how many points were dedicated to them. And despite their proficiency in strength-based skills, fighters still suffered major penalties for wearing heavy armor, which was one of the biggest perks for being the fighter. In fact, fighters were so skill deficient that many couldn't even function as town guards, due to their lack of perception-based skills. It didn't help that the fighter couldn't afford to put points in wisdom, charisma, or intelligence either. Older editions of D&D doled out sizable stat bonuses and penalties only if a character rolled exceptionally high or low. But 3rd edition flattened out the ability score progression to make it more linear, which made it easier to get saddled with a negative modifier. Fighters required strength, dexterity, and constitution to be good at their vocation, unable to afford putting points into the non-combat stats. Spellcasters, on the other hand, didn't suffer nearly as much under the new system, as all they needed was one good spellcasting stat. They could easily counter their shortcomings by either staying in the back row, or using spells to enhance their physical attributes. Monsters in 3rd edition were also granted ability score bonuses, often making them even stronger than the player characters. Many of these beasts were larger than the standard D&D races, so they received additional combat bonuses in the form of a longer reach and improved grappling. This had the funny side effect of occasionally making the fighter weaker than a spellcaster's summoned monster. Spellcasters could also polymorph into monsters substantially more powerful and useful than a mere fighter. For the first time in D&D, the fighter's role in the team dynamic was in jeopardy. A lot of these issues came about because spellcasting was revamped to be more exciting and streamlined. It used to be very hard in older editions to cast spells in battle without having the casting get interrupted, and the more powerful a spell was, the more significant the drawback for casting it. Polymorph, for example, had a small chance of outright killing its target, while the haste spell gradually aged its recipient with every use. 3rd edition removed a lot of these penalties, allowing spellcasters to evoke their most potent spells more regularly. The new saving throw system didn't help fighters out either. D&D's old save system was finicky and clunky, granting saving throws only against a handful of effects and adjacent equivalents. So the new system instead used 3 saves that were based on core ability scores: dexterity, wisdom, and constitution. High-level fighters used to have amazing saving throws across the board, but the 3rd edition fighter was only competent at constitution, aka fortitude saves. This made the fighter vulnerable to spells and a host of reflex traps. In old school D&D, high-level fighters could bum rush traps with their superior saves, but now this role was better suited to the new barbarian class with its trap sense feature. Paladins, monks, and rangers also became a lot more prominent as fighter alternatives. These were present in older editions, but characters had to roll high ability scores during character creation just to qualify for the class. 3rd edition removed ability score requirements and increased the number of core classes, reducing the fighter's predominant role as the party muscle. Yet this wound up being a good thing in the fighter's case. The fighter identity was broader than a shoreline, including anything from a knight decked out in battle armor to a drunken schmuck good with a billy club. The paladin, monk, and ranger were created as essentially more exotic variants of the fighter. Now that 3rd edition made them all core classes, however, there needed to be a reason why players would choose a bland, nondescript fighting man instead. So the fighter was reimagined as an elite soldier, a tactical combatant with superior training that could dominate the battlefield with their combat techniques. This was supported by the fact that 3rd edition fighters had the largest access to D&D's new feat system. Feats gave characters access to a library of abilities to choose from as they leveled up, and fighters received more bonus feats than any other class. The downside is that all the fighter really had was feats, as they lacked any class features. The intention was to allow players to build their own brand of fighter, but feats were nowhere near as good as class-specific abilities. At least not in 3rd edition, where feats were often incremental bonuses or all but useless in their base form. In fact, many uninspiring feat options became known as feat taxes. Feat taxes referred to abilities that no one wanted, but were required to take in order to use other feats or even basic game features. Grappling, for example, gave the grappler's opponents a free attack of opportunity unless they had the improved grapple feat. The improved grapple feat, in turn, needed the improved unarmed strike feat or a level in the monk class. So that's 2 mandatory feats just to avoid getting clobbered for daring to lay hands on the enemy. This reduced fighters to one-trick ponies that could get shut down very easily in combat. For example, incorporeal creatures and monster swarms were immune to not only grappling but getting knocked prone, which was generally considered one of the best fighter skills at the time. Not to mention that any creature larger than the fighter would be a difficult opponent to disable. Standing in stark contrast to this was the Wizard, a versatile combatant that could always change their spells in anticipation of the next encounter. Spells were also generally stronger than feats too, as they were balanced as a semi-limited resource. D&D's modern publisher, Wizards of the Coast, seemed to be aware of the Wizard-Fighter disparity as they gradually took steps to address it. The best way to make the fighter comparable to spellcasters, of course, is to simply give them access to spells. This led to the Tome of Battle, the Book of Nine Swords from 2006. This book introduced a new spellcasting system called maneuvers. Unlike spells, characters recovered maneuvers after each encounter, so no rest required. While never reaching the potency of high-level spells, maneuvers at least granted some versatility and burst potential. Two maneuver schools were ostensibly magical, allowing characters to blend with shadows and conjure flames. This is why many people compared the Book of Nine Swords specifically to wuxia, Chinese fiction focused on supernatural martial artists. The Book of Nine Swords didn't make adjustments to the core D&D classes, but instead added 3 new ones: the Crusader, the Warblade, and the Sword Sage. These classes have clear analogs in the Paladin, Fighter, and Rogue/Monk respectively. The Warblade possessed the most grounded maneuver schools, as it was mostly focused on battle tactics, physical endurance, mental fortitude, and dynamic stunts. Players could focus on a specific element they felt was most important to their character, thanks to the wide variety of maneuvers. And although the Warblade was not officially a fighter, it would have a significant impact on the fighter going forward. This brings us to the most controversial version of the fighter, hailing from 4th edition in 2008. This fighter took the Warblade concept to its next logical step. Instead of coming up with completely different mechanics for fighters, 4th edition combined the Book of Nine Swords with the standard D&D abilities. Every class now essentially had spells that reset with every encounter, as well as more powerful spells that reset on a daily basis. These spells were referred to as powers, with the fighter's powers literally dubbed exploits. Exploits represented the complex combat maneuvers a warrior could perform in the midst of battle. This slotted the fighter as the 4th edition's defender role, which made it akin to the video game MMO tank. Its role was to manipulate the position of enemies and allies to ensure the fighter was always the primary target of enemy attacks. While 4th edition succeeded in more evenly balancing the classes, many fans were not happy with the change. These drastic shakeups were an attempt to correct the flaws of 3rd edition, but they left players feeling alienated, if not outright repelled. In the case of the fighter, many preferred them as a simpler class alternative. While some folks wanted a complex fighter, it didn't necessarily mean they wanted to manage a spell-like resource. 5th edition was released in 2014, and its version of the fighter can be described as a compromise between all of the editions. Fighters still get outclassed by spellcasters at higher levels, but the power disparity is nowhere near as bad as it used to be. The new concentration mechanic, for example, put a hard limit on the number of spells a caster could have active at the same time. While summoners and shapeshifters continued to outclass fighters in a variety of ways, fighters were some of the best damage dealers in the game. 5th edition fighters came with plenty of new class features, their most valuable of which was the ability to perform a slew of extra attacks. Action Surge is particularly valuable, allowing the fighter to double their actions once per short rest. Part of the reason the 5th edition fighter outputs such considerable damage is that this is the 1st edition willing to grant extra attacks to them without any stipulations. In AD&D, fighters only got an extra attack every other round. Only once they reached their 3rd attack improvement could they attack twice per round, which, once again, was their maximum. And even then, enemies were allowed to retaliate between the fighter's attacks. In basic D&D, fighters could only execute an extra attack if they were able to hit their opponent on a natural 2, the worst roll outside of a crit fail. So extra attacks only came into play against low-level trash mobs with abysmal ACs. 3rd edition granted fighters an extra attack only if they didn't move on that round. Every subsequent attack also suffered a massive penalty, to the point where they weren't even worth rolling. 5th edition's fighter not only simplified things by abandoning these stipulations, but also scaled the fighter's damage with enemy HP. On top of this, the 5th edition fighter still received more feats than any other class, with feats in 5e being more impactful than earlier incarnations. And if a player didn't like any of the feats on offer, they could forego taking one to boost their ability scores instead. so players could carefully craft their own tactical warrior or continue with the big dumb fighter tradition. Although the fighter remained a poor choice for social encounters, it extracted more of a benefit out of the 5th edition skill system. One of the important elements that 5th edition took from 4th edition were the condensed athletics and acrobatics skills. 3rd edition had these stunts broken up into multiple niche abilities, such as climbing, swimming, balancing, and tumbling. By combining these abilities, it ensured the fighter was competent at a wide variety of physical maneuvers. Additionally, these skills were now used to power most physical activities, including grappling and shoving, making it easier for a fighter to perform these actions, no matter their build. By far the most interesting development for the fighter in 5th edition is its archetypes. Archetypes are a rough evolution of kits from 2nd edition. They allowed characters to swap out some of their generic class features to play a more specific variation of their class with unique abilities. The Barbarian, for example, used to be a kit for the 2nd edition fighter. Early archetypes for the 5th edition fighter were relatively straightforward, such as the Champion archetype that mostly focused on scoring more critical hits. For a more involved playstyle, players could try out the Eldritch Knight, a magic-slinging swordsman that combined fighter and wizard mechanics. The last archetype included in the player's handbook was the Battlemaster, a subdued successor to the 4th edition fighter. Battlemaster maneuvers don't scale as well as spells, but they add some variety and finesse to the fighter class. Other archetypes later included were the Echo Knight, Rune Knight, Psy Warrior, and Arcane Archer. The Echo Knight allows the fighter to create a magical duplicate of himself. The Rune Knight can transform into a giant, and the latter two archetypes gain unique psionic and arcane abilities respectively. While the abilities on offer are not as versatile as an actual spell list, they add to the complexity of the class, shifting the fighter from the mundane into the magical. Old school fighters previously needed magic items to perform fantastic feats, but magic was now baked into the modern class, granting exhilarating powers that the once featureless foot soldier could only dream of. It's always controversial whenever an iconic class is changed, given how many players are loyal to that class's history and identity. But it's important to keep in mind that D&D as a whole has radically changed, with every class evolving in response. Not only have spellcasters grown in power, but every class has received an array of options to suit a variety of playstyles. Where magical classes were once the minority in old school D&D, only 4 of the starting classes in 5th edition lack magical abilities, and that's only for their first few levels. Modern D&D operates at a higher power level across a broader, more player-driven scope, so it's only natural that the fighter adapts with this trend towards epic fantasy. It's also debatable that the Barbarian has made the fighter's old role obsolete. While it's useful to have a simple class for newer players, in many ways the Barbarian now fills this particular niche. The current fighter is a compromise of sorts, retaining its direct playstyle while tacking on optional fantasy elements. Those loyal to the base fighter can play the simple archetypes, but the more exotic variants are arguably where the class excels. Luckily, they're not mandatory, because despite all the newfangled classes, spells, maneuvers, and feats, sometimes all you want to do is smash stuff with a big, dumb fighter.